After we first got our hands on the Motorola Edge 30 and checked out the spec sheet, it was clear that the only feature that could disappoint would be the camera system. All of the other elements have been well balanced, so we are keen to see if the camera could hold up in the same manner. And having used this phone for about a week now, it is safe to say that Motorola Edge 30 is the best mid-range phone introduced so far in 2022. Now, the previous statement didn't quite say Motorola Edge 30 is the best mid-range phone you can buy, because honestly, there's still a lot of great phones from last year's lineup that are even offered at greatly discounted prices. However, compared to everything introduced this year, the Edge 30 is an absolutely better phone. Over the last few years, each time we would test a Motorola phone, there would always be that infamous but. However, this time, that is not the case, as Edge 30 has met our expectations, and now, in May of 2022, I can safely say that the Edge 30 is the best mid-range device we've seen so far this year. One of the main reasons why Motorola Edge 30 is better than other phones is because it has no big weak points. It is definitely not a perfect phone by any means, but it simply didn't fail in any regard. The most important reason for this is that Motorola was able to get their hands on the Snapdragon 778G Plus processor. This is an upgraded version of the 778G chip, which is unmatched by any other mid-range processor we have seen this year so far, such as the Qualcomm Series 6 line of processors, the Exynos 1280 found in the Galaxy A53, the Dimensity 920 and Realme 9 Pro Plus and Redmi Note 11 Pro Plus models. To simply put it, this is absolutely perfect processor for phones in this price range for day-to-day tasks, multiple apps open at the same time, multimedia consumption, camera image processing, UI speed, moderate energy consumption, and even gaming. None of it is too much for the Snapdragon 778G Plus chip. Each of the competing chips will have some troubles for certain use, and even if they don't, the 778G Plus chip will do it better. Sure, there'll be those who claim that their phone is faster, mainly referring to the excellent Snapdragon 860 and 870 chips, but generally speaking, the 778G Plus is a processor tailored for an average user, especially if you combine it with a properly balanced rest of the system. There's no much point in having the fastest processor at the expense of having a bad screen or a camera system, except for gaming. Those high-performance gaming phones do have their audience, but an average user is looking for a well-balanced experience in every aspect of the phone. The same can be said for the Motorola's last year G100 model that, compared to the Edge 30, didn't have anything to bring to the table excluding the raw computing power, which I doubt is useful anywhere besides playing Asphalt or other demanding mobile games. The Edge 30 is a better rounded phone that is a jack of all trades, but still has enough computing power to not disappoint. And while we are on the topic of processing power and performance, the Edge 30 comes with 8GB of RAM in its standard version, which I really have to commend, given that mid-range devices usually have 6GB with an option to pay extra for the additional 2GB. Speaking of hardware, we should note that this device also features a Snapdragon sound chip, which enhances the listening experience on wireless earbuds. We will have to grab a pair of supported earbuds first to see whether it's just a gimmick or this feature finally is the beginning of the end for the wired earbuds, but don't hold your breath just yet. Interestingly, no manufacturer other than Motorola has yet decided to implement this chip. Perhaps Motorola was the first company to get a supply of this year's latest chips. Now, another thing where Motorola has done a great job with the Edge 30 phone is the camera system. We have two very good 50 megapixel sensor cameras. The main one with optical image stabilization makes a difference over competitors who implement much cheaper solutions when it comes to the ultra-wide cameras. Motorola has in fact implemented a camera system from the Edge 30 Pro model into its significantly less expensive phone. In the high-end market, this camera system didn't get much praise, but for the mid-range device, it is the most powerful one available, at least on paper. But we will touch more on the cameras a bit later in our review. The phone design is modern and I would say rather attractive, but I don't quite like the camera block, so overall I'd give it 3 out of 5 for looks. If the camera block was better looking, the score would definitely be higher as the phone is quite thin and light and fits nicely in the hand, as in your pocket as well. What I especially like is the bezels around the screen are really nice and thin, especially the bottom one, so-called chin of the phone, which is visibly thinner than, say, on the Galaxy A53 that we got to test recently. The phone shape feels similar as we've seen it on numerous different models, all of which draw inspiration from Apple's past and current devices. The flat frame and completely flat surfaces of the screen and the back of the phone give this phone that elegant note. And judging by some similarly shaped models from previous year, the audience definitely likes it. The frame and back of the phone are made of premium polycarbonate in order to get the lightest possible device that weighs only 155 grams. Now also I have to point out, with only 6.79 millimeters, the Edge 30 is by far the thinnest 5G smartphone. It also comes with a rather unusual IP52 certificate for dust and water resistance, and while we're used to seeing IP53 rating on most of the devices, I needed to further investigate this IP rating. The number 5 is dust resistance, and as for the second figure, the only difference between IP53 and IP52 is the angle at which the water can safely splash on the phone. IP53 rating makes the phone resistant to water splashes at an angle up to 60 degrees, while the IP52 does it up to 15 degrees. So if you own the Edge 30 and it starts to rain, keep an eye at the angle at which it falls down if the wind is blowing it sideways. Yes, of course, I'm being sarcastic, as it feels like people who come up with these ratings are just trolling sometimes. Now, as for the available color variants, our test unit is Meteor Gray, which honestly looks more bluish to us, but in addition to that, the phone also comes in Supermoon Silver and Aurora Green. I've had numerous objections on design of Motorola devices in the past, especially the cheaper models, but this time I think they did quite a good job. The layout of the connectors, keys, and everything else on the phone is pretty standard, but I was happy to note that Motorola finally decided to ditch the Google Assistant key. On the right side of the phone, there's power button and a volume rocker, which are pretty solid with the little wiggle we usually see on low-end and mid-range devices. The left side, however, is completely clean. On the bottom, there is a SIM card slot with no SD support, and you should keep that in mind since the phone comes with 128 gigabytes of storage, a USB port, a main microphone, and a speaker grill. Motorola is going forward with stereo sound as standard on its models, so the role of the second speaker is assigned to the handset speaker just above the top of the screen. As for the display, the Edge 30 comes with 6.5-inch AMOLED screen, which seems ideal for those who don't like huge screens, with its Full HD Plus resolution, HDR10 Plus support, and 144Hz refresh rate. It's not that kind of a screen like the ones we see on premium devices that is able to finally adjust the refresh rate. It only switches between 60Hz, 144Hz, and auto option that will determine the screen refresh based on the content of the screen. Speaking of the screen, let's mention that the fingerprint sensor is below the screen of this phone, which is covered with Gorilla Glass 3 protective glass. Not quite the latest and greatest. The screen is solid, not top of its class in this price range, like the ones on the Samsung Galaxy A53 for instance, but it's unlikely that anyone will have any complaints either. We haven't measured the maximum peak brightness, but compared to A53 at 50% brightness, the Samsung screen was noticeably brighter. In order to have the thinnest 5G device, Motorola had to make some compromises and opt for a 4020 mAh battery, which had however proved very decent in our 10-hour YouTube playback test at 50% brightness, leaving the phone at 46%, largely due to excellent energy efficiency of Qualcomm's new chip. The charger is rated at 33 watts and it will take about 45 minutes to charge the phone from 0 to 100. Now when it comes to cameras, the Motorola Edge 30 is somewhat atypical phone. Why? Well, let's see. Well, with most of the models we've seen over the years, manufacturers seem to be competing over who will put more cameras on the phone, which leaves us with a main camera with a lot of megapixels, a much worse ultra-wide, and a couple of sensors that don't even intend to be used. All of this is done just for the marketing materials can say the phone has 4 or 5 different cameras, which would look better in the eyes of a less informed customer. Well, this time, Motorola has decided on a completely different approach, which will probably seem more reasonable and honest for those who are technically savvy. This model comes with only one main camera and ultra-wide camera, both with 50 megapixels, and that's pretty much it. There is no dedicated macro and telephoto sensors with lower specification. Admittedly, the ultra-wide also doubles as a macro sensor, but we'll talk about that a little later. And if you're wondering what the third opening of the camera system is, it's a 2 megapixel depth sensor, which isn't used directly by the user, but rather as an aid for image processing. Its role is probably not negligible because, as we've seen on some other models with cheaper high megapixel sensors, processing is a very important factor in getting most out of them. And that's exactly where Motorola seemed to have taken a step forward and managed to reduce some of the shortcomings of these sensors and get a bit better results than some of the previous 50 megapixel models from the middle and the upper middle class. The main complaint we had on those phones in terms of slightly softer look in this case is largely reduced by a very well balanced sharpness filter that does not seem excessive or artificial and adds the impression of sharper daily photos even when viewed on the big screen and especially viewed on the mobile phones or social networks. This is further improved by the excellent noise processing, which on these sensors is sometimes noticeable even during the day and can further affect the level of detail. While on the Edge 30, it is practically unnoticeable on the main sensor and barely noticeable in some scenes on ultra-wide camera, whose performance is not up par to the smaller aperture, f2.2 instead of f1.8. There is a small difference in level of detail between the two cameras, but much less than in the case of the most current models. The color reproduction also differs slightly, but the general look of the photos is very similar and we can describe it as very natural, with only a little embellishment in most scenes, although there were a few exceptions where the color were more accented. The photos have a lot of contrast, especially in the main sensor, and the dynamic range is solid in the main and slightly narrower on the ultra-wide camera. It is also worth mentioning that the main sensor is equipped with optical stabilization, which is nice to see, while the ultra-wide camera doesn't have it. But with this type of sensor, due to its width of 114 degrees shooting angle, it is not even necessary. Both cameras use autofocus via phase detection, but in the case of the main one, it is a multi-directional one, which is also something we don't see very often. When we mentioned the autofocus, the ultra-wide camera also has an additional role as a macro sensor on this phone, and the results it is able to deliver are better than most of the dedicated macro sensors we've seen on phones, due to the higher resolution and aperture and the ability to focus properly. Makes you wonder why this approach is not more common, because it is definitely better. And when it gets dark, Motorola's night vision, that is, the night mode, takes over, and then we have a bit of mixed impressions. In some situations, night photos are more attractive at first glance than on some other models compared to the Edge 30, with a more contrasting display and saturated colors, but a closer look reveals the use of sharpness filter that is not as subtle as we saw in day photos. In some scenes, this is more pronounced, in some less so the impression is that the night photos are mainly optimized for the screen of the mobile phone in order to look as sharp and beautiful as possible to the eye. However, it seems that Motorola has made some improvements in this area compared to some previous models. Now, as for the video, the recording quality in 4K is very good on the ultra-wide, even great on the main camera, but only while shooting something relatively static. Although at first we thought that the problem was stabilization, it is actually quite decent, but while we're walking or making sudden movements, the camera tends to re-trigger a focus seek, which manifests itself as a twitch in the video and spoils the overall impression. Interestingly, we didn't notice this in Full HD resolution, so we believe this is something that Motorola can correct through a software update. If that ever happens, this would be a really good phone for daily video recordings, probably one of the best in its class. Now, as for the night shooting, the ultra-wide sensor is usable, but not great due to the smaller aperture, while the main one is solid, again, provided the frame is relatively static. To wrap up our impression about the cameras, I have to mention the excellent 32 megapixel front camera, which pleasantly surprised us with its sharpness, details, and color reproduction during the day, with solid performance even at night. Thanks to a great camera sensor and a CPU that processes very nicely and easily, we got a phone with cameras that are at the very top of this price range. And since we got the chance to test the Samsung A53 camera alongside the Edge 30, we came to a conclusion that it produces slightly better photos overall than its Samsung competitor. And it definitely seems that there is still a lot of room for further software improvements, which might further tune the already great camera system. Now, let's talk about software. Android 12 on this phone is also one of the advantages at the time when almost all phones in this class come with Android 11. And since we don't have any of the last year's mid-range phones still in our studio, please comment below if your device has received an Android 12 update. The Edge 30 will have 3 years of regular software updates, or to simply put it, 2 major software upgrades, which means it will likely have Android 14 somewhere down the line. We also have to mention that the phone comes with the ThinkShield technology from Lenovo, which makes the phone safer in many ways, especially in business environments. ThinkShield and Samsung's Knox are the only security systems on this type of mobile phones, but this doesn't seem to matter too much for the majority of the users, unless you're a sysadmin. Visually, I think the Android 12 is a good step forward because for the first time in a while, its look is not boring since it has adapted some of the things that the phone manufacturers have already used in their user interfaces. I have to say that I wasn't blown away with the big tabs in the drop-down menu since they take up so much space. The system doesn't get the chance to display too many of them, but it's just a nitpick at the end. However, we have to praise Motorola for finally taking the leap and making some drastic changes in their software features, which bugged us in the previous iterations. They made this phone come to life with the Android 12 upgrade, and so the user has a significant number of options to customize the interface and colors of the UI. With a solid, sharp screen, it all works far better than before. Let's also mention the Ready For functionality and the ability to turn this phone into an Android desktop computer with a monitor or a TV, a feature offered by only a few manufacturers and none in this price range. I'm not sure how much enthusiasm there is for this feature, but it seems that for a majority of the users, at least, it's not very important. However, the Ready For feature and ThinkShield will be welcomed by the selected audience that will really appreciate these functions. As we wrap up this review, let me just say that Motorola Edge 30 is definitely using its momentum, being privileged to use a newer and better chipset, which unlike the previous year wasn't the case for 2022 so far. And that simply allows it to have a head start from its competition in the mid-range category this spring. And I don't know how long it will have this advantage, but it is expected to be available in retail in less than 10 days, according to the information we have, of course. And if we take into the account that no other manufacturer has announced its models with this processor, let alone arrive on the market, Motorola has probably a whole month of dominance in this segment ahead of it. Now, the cameras are also another thing that deviates from what the competitors offer, with the two 50-megapixel sensors that are not often seen in this price range, or to be precise, seen for the first time in this price category, because the ultra-wide camera in this category is a lot of times just an afterthought. But the fact remains that Motorola was able to bring the whole camera system from its flagship to this much affordable segment. We should praise the step forward in the design and certainly the dimensions of the device itself, the instance that the phone is being able to be both light and thin, and that it's not paying with some big compromises. I think the Edge 30 is a very good improvement for Motorola on many fronts. The price of the Edge 30 is around 450 euros or roughly $475 US. Again, when we consider that many very good models of the 2021 season can still be found, things are becoming much more complicated, but these are already things the customers need to solve. It is up to us to present the phones with all their strengths and weaknesses, not to impose our views on the buyer. Again, when we consider that many very good models of the 2021 season can still be found, things are becoming much more complicated, but these are already things that the customer needs to solve. It is up to us to present the phone with all of their strengths and weaknesses, not to impose our views on the buyer. If it weren't for those last year's models on the offer, this phone would without a doubt win Best Buy award in the mid-range price category. Motorola Edge 30 phone is the first device this year that I can say is really worth buying, the first phone that is equal compared to the models from the previous season. And I see the Edge 30 primarily as a hint of better days in the mobile industry. a hint that many not-so-solid phones like the ones we saw in previous months will very quickly become a thing of the past that we hope to forget. With Motorola Edge 30, future does look a little brighter, and we hope that the 2022 phone lineup follows its steps going forward. Thank you for watching the Bench House review of the Motorola Edge 30 phone, a great addition to the mid-range price bracket. If you're looking for more tech reviews, subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed the review, don't forget to give a like to the video. My name is Marco, and I will see you next time.